Good morning. I don't typically like to stand behind, so I'm going to just take this and move around. Good morning. My name is Jim Remar. I am with the Cosmosphere. It's nice to see some familiar faces and friends out here. We have obviously a set amount of time. I've got a lot of slides, so I'm just going to start flying through this. Cosmosphere, our mission is to inspire the future through space exploration. Our vision is to inspire all generations by telling the international story of space exploration and risk-taking while providing unparalleled education opportunities that share the spirit of adventure and possibilities. And then our core values are financial sustainability, preservation, education, innovation, excellence, and inclusivity. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Cosmosphere, we are located in the metropolis of Hutchinson, Kansas. Smack dab in the center of the United States. We started out in 1962 as a planetarium, and today are one of the larger museums dedicated to preserving the history of space exploration. We have one of the largest collections of U.S. artifacts and one of the larger collections of Soviet artifacts, and that puts us in the position to tell the story of the space race. But more importantly, we're about preserving history, preserving the story of the space race, preserving the story of the present and future of space exploration. Not only do we house a large collection of artifacts, display these artifacts, tell the story of those artifacts, we also have a division called SpaceWorks, which does restoration of various artifacts. And I will highlight our museum, but then I want to focus on some of the projects that SpaceWorks has been able to do over the years. So this is our museum. If you've been to the Cosmosphere, you haven't seen our new museum. If you have been here recently, you have started to see some of our renovations. Back in 2019, we started a project to literally redo the entire museum galleries. So we've got about 40,000 square foot of gallery space. This December, we'll have finished that project and have literally redone every aspect of our museum. So this is leading down into our museum. We tell the story of the space race, but we start with the V2. So obviously, Werner von Braun and his team developed the first ICBM. We tell that story, and then we begin to tell the story of the race to space. So kind of a point-counterpoint between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's a pair of Soviet RD-107 engines. And this is literally the only gallery in the world where you can stand and you can compare and contrast the Soviet Vostok, which was the first spacecraft to go into space, the US Mercury, which was the US's first spacecraft to go into space, Soviet Voskhod, and then Gemini. So that's Vostok, Liberty Bell 7, Voskhod, and then Gemini 10 on loan to us from the National Air and Space Museum. And then this is our redone Apollo gallery. Our anchor artifact is Apollo 13, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but that too is also on loan to us from the National Air and Space Museum. So SpaceWorks does replication, fabrication work, exhibit work, and restoration work for groups all over the world. This particular piece is an Apollo era Block 1 replica spacecraft that SpaceWorks fabricated, and this is hanging in the lobby of the Neil Armstrong Engineering Facility at Purdue University. We did a lot of work for the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum, McMinnville, Oregon. If you've heard of the Spruce Goose, that's home of the Spruce Goose. We designed, fabricated, and installed the vast majority of their space exhibits. We built a replica lunar module and a replica lunar rover, built a replica V2, and then fabricated and installed all the exhibit components. That is a replica Apollo command module that was used in the movie Apollo 13, happens to be hanging from Sikorsky. We've also done major restoration on original V2s. This particular V2 was done for the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, Wright Pat. That is a V2 that was one of our favorite projects. During the course of the restoration, our technicians found 50 caliber slugs embedded in the engine. So it was apparent that at some point our allies came in, strafed that V2, and then the Germans kicked the V2 off the rail car. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force acquired it, and then we restored it and painted it to its original configuration there in the camouflage. This V2 we did for White Sands, so as many of you know, after Operation Paperclip, Von Braun and his team set up shop at White Sands for testing. This is an original V2 from that era, and we did the restoration for it for the White Sands Missile Range. We've also worked with the National Air and Space Museum to do some work on Gemini spacecraft. That's Jim Lovell inspecting Gemini 12. And then this is just a little behind the scenes of our shop. We've fabricated several display cases for various museums to display Gemini spacecraft. I believe that is Gemini 6, which is currently on display at the Stafford Air and Space Museum in Weatherford, Oklahoma. Before going to Stafford, it was at the Omniplex in Oklahoma City. And then some of our work that we've done has also supported Hollywood projects. If you've seen the movie Apollo 13, most of us have probably seen it. Cosmosphere Spaceworks built about 80% of the set props. So we built all the interiors of the spacecraft, both the command module, the lunar module. We produced the in-flight garments as well as the spacesuits. So this is all built at the Cosmosphere at Spaceworks in Hutchinson, Kansas. So going back to Apollo 13, after the mission, NASA wanted to just figure out what happened. And so they had gutted the spacecraft. At some point, the craft went out of the United States over to France, where it was on display. During that time, the Cosmosphere began collecting pieces of Apollo 13. Using part numbers and serial numbers, we were able to positively identify as being authentic pieces from the spacecraft. Smithsonian and NASA began working with the Department of State to get the spacecraft back to the United States. I believe around 95, 96, Apollo 13 came back to the United States to Hutchinson, where Spaceworks reinstalled probably 80%-ish of the original hardware back into the spacecraft, where it now sits on display. How many of you know about Liberty Bell 7? Most everybody is, thank you. Gus Grissom, second manned American flight, 15-minute suborbital, basically an up and down shot. When Grissom landed, he began preparing himself and the spacecraft for recovery. At some point, the hatch jettisoned prematurely, flooding the spacecraft. Grissom was rescued, but unfortunately the craft sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, where it resided for 38 years. The Cosmosphere, working with the Discovery Channel, the Deep Sea Salvage Company Oceaneering, in 1999 set out upon an expedition to locate and recover the spacecraft. They were successful in doing so, so the spacecraft was then transported to Hutchinson, Kansas, where our Spaceworks team did the restoration and conservation of that spacecraft. We literally took every piece of that spacecraft apart, removed every component, cleaned the corrosion, applied corrosion inhibitors, and then reinstalled all of the components back into the spacecraft. Because of our efforts in the recovery as well as the restoration, NASA and the Smithsonian signed title of that spacecraft over to the Cosmosphere, where it now resides down in our Hall of Space Museum. But you can see the corrosion that took place at those depths. One of the first things we did when we received the craft was to wash it or bathe it for a period of several weeks to remove any of the corrosion to stabilize it before we began the process of restoration. Those are the tiles from the exterior of the spacecraft. And then that's the restored spacecraft as it looks today. And it continues to be in phenomenal condition. Done other work supporting various exhibits throughout the world. This particular exhibit was a group out of Europe. This exhibit crisscrossed Europe. We built several of the replicas and then supported the exhibit with many of our artifacts. We built a forward section of the lunar module ascent. That's a lunicod. That's a replica command module that we fabricated for the exhibit. Replica lunar rover. We also did this isn't a great picture, but we built a UFO. Since there aren't too many original specifications or pictures of UFOs, we did take some artistic liberty. So this UFO was built for an exhibit in Taipei, Taiwan, on aliens. So yes, that is an original UFO. So one of the cooler projects that we were able to work on was the conservation of the original F1 rocket engines. As many of you are aware, in 2013, Bezos Expeditions funded recovery of the original Apollo F1 engines. They were out at sea for about a month, March of 2013. When they were finished with their recovery expedition, they contracted with SpaceWorks to do the conservation. So as you all know, the Saturn V is a huge vehicle. The F1s were located down at the bottom of the rocket, the first stage, about 110 feet. Each F1 is approximately 19 feet tall by 12 foot wide, and each produced about 1.5 million pounds of thrust. When the rocket reached about 42 miles in altitude, the first stage was jettisoned. At that point, the first stage began its descent back to Earth. The F1s probably at some point broke away from the first stage. When the recovery expedition set out, they weren't sure what they were going to find. They were hopeful that they would find intact F1 engines. The hope was that they would find the F1 engines from Apollo 11, but again, they weren't sure what they were going to locate when they went to the bottom. So when they got down there, they had ROVs. You can see the impact of hitting the ocean and then hitting the bottom of the seabed had on those engines. Those engines are comprised of some of the strongest metals known to human. When they hit the ocean surface, they were probably traveling around 400 miles per hour. Hitting that surface was like hitting concrete. As they hit, they would then start to decrease, and then once they began to get into waters with less pressure or less air, then they would begin to accelerate again. As you can see, that's the thrust chamber from an F1 engine, and it's embedded 3 to 4 feet in the seafloor. That's a part of the S1C first stage. So these engines components have been on the surface for over 40 years. And as you all know, one of the harshest things to something that has been embedded in water for that period of time is air. And so one of the first things that the people on the boats did was began to rinse all the artifacts, all the objects with seawater to keep them constantly wet. And the person spraying that water is actually Jeff Bezos. So these are pieces of the recovered components. When they were down with the recovery, it took about an hour and a half to go down and another hour and a half to go up. So they couldn't just pick a piece, bring it back up, and then go back down. So what they did was they had large recovery baskets. They had 2 recovery baskets. Each were about 15 feet by 20 feet. And what they would do is they would pick the component up, place it in the recovery basket, and then when they were finished with that operation, they would bring the recovery basket back up and then set it on the deck of the ship. Once the ship got to dock, SpaceWorks then took over. SpaceWorks was responsible for offloading the components onto the trailers. We used some really ingenious technology to preserve the components during transport. We took cotton towels and wrapped all the components with the cotton towels and then sprayed them with seawater, and then used heat-activated shrink wrap to hold the cotton towels in place. And surprisingly, when the objects got back to Hutchinson, or got to Hutchinson, the towels were all still wet. We wanted to continue to preserve the objects to ensure that they were kept wet throughout the duration of their trip from the Cape to the Hutchinson. And the yellow contraptions behind the trailer, those are the recovery baskets. Once they got to SpaceWorks, then we began to place all the components in water retention basins. They sat there for several months, working to stabilize the artifacts with corrosion inhibitors. There was probably 25,000 pounds of objects that we were able to conserve. And then once the objects were stabilized, they were each scanned, 3D scanned. So this slide is when we positively identified one of the rocket engines, the thrust chamber, as being from Apollo 11. One of our technicians, Jared Alexander, who is now a conservator at the Air and Space Museum, was a former weapons technician in the Air Force, and he had used UV and black light in the past, and so he got an idea to see if he could positively or see the etching of the engine, and so he shut all the lights down, closed off all the windows, and then using UV and black light captured this serial number, which positively identified that as the center engine from Apollo 11. Then each object was placed in its own treatment basin. That's Buzz Aldrin standing over the treatment with Apollo 11 engine. And then these are all of the objects after treatment. And museums across the country, including the National Air and Space Museum, now display these pieces. This is the Museum of Flight in Seattle. And then, I know I'm running out of time. Some of my colleagues will talk about this project, but one of the highlights, I guess, of my tenure is the work we were able to do with a phenomenal team led by Sandra Tetley on the restoration of the historic Mission Operations Control Room. It's Chris Kraft, the father of Mission Control. So our team was responsible for the consoles. So we did all the restoration on the consoles. You'll hear later about the restoration of the actual MOCR itself, but we worked specifically on the consoles. And as you'll hear, the MOCR was returned to when it was during Apollo 11. Per the flight controllers, we returned the consoles to when they were used during Apollo 15. Apollo 15 was the height of technology during the Apollo program, and the flight controllers felt that that was a proper representation of the consoles. So that's original mission control at the Cape, and then NASA moved here to this campus. This is during the Gemini program. That's flight launch control, which is at the Cape. And then this is mission control during the Apollo program. And so the challenge was to recreate what you see in that picture. And if you haven't seen the MOCR, the entire restoration team did a phenomenal job. It is breathtaking. In fact, I think some of the flight controllers felt like they were home when they walked into it and saw it for the first time after completion. Charlie Duke was Capcom Apollo 11, the ceremonial lighting of the cigars. That's Gene Kranz at the flight desk. This is during the Apollo 13 mission. And this is what mission control today looks like. So this is the mission control that is used for station. This is what mission control looked like prior to the restoration. It was void of any real visitor experience, any programming. The desks, consoles were stale, so the project challenge was to return it to as it was when you saw in the previous pictures. That's the visitor viewing area. That's our curator, Shannon, as we begin to document the consoles. You can see all the tags from the documentation. And so we began a careful removal of each one of the consoles. We removed the first 2 rows first, brought them to Hutchinson where we did the restoration. Then we took them down to Wichita, Kansas, where the Guppy picked them up, brought them back here to Ellington, and then we took the final 2 rows of consoles. There's more memory in your phones than in the computers for the consoles. So then, working with our team, we began to program the consoles to have data and telemetry as the flight controllers would have seen. And then this is what the MOCR looks like today. And that's Gene Kranz. I happened to be standing in the visitor room. I think that was CBS Network interviewing Mr. Kranz at his flight console, and I got to capture that picture, which is pretty awesome.